While the strength of their armed forces grew throughout the Second World War, bringing them to the forefront of modern military superpowers, the United States spent the first few years of World War II very firmly on the back foot. Surprised at Pearl Harbor, and though quick to retaliate, until the latter months of 1942, US troops fought a strong retreating defensive throughout the Pacific theatre. However, after the Battle of Midway, which saw the repaired and regrouped American fleet destroy most of the Japanese aircraft carriers and a large portion of their combat shipping, things started to change. The tide was beginning to turn, and for the first time, victory in all Allied theatres was possible, though there was still a long, hard fight ahead. The battle that would ultimately stick in the minds of many an American citizen and serviceman was the Battle of Iwo Jima. It marked a decisive victory for the Allied forces and one of many losses for the Japanese war machine, a level that simply could not be sustained. Before this battle could be fought and won, however, there were other territories to retake and some promises to fulfill. Resistance against the Axis was growing stronger by the day, and as battles intensified across the globe, it was a time of intense planning and strategizing for the Allies. Keeping the seaways open to move troops into position all over the world was of vital importance, and while the British Navy was taking a lead role in the North Atlantic, in the South Pacific theatre of war, US pilots and Marines were spearheading the Allied counterattack against Japan's drive for dominance. In New Guinea and the Solomon Islands north of Australia, Japan was now fighting a defensive war under the direction of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto had, unusually, studied in the United States. He'd even initially opposed the militarism that led Japan into war. But now he was a marked man for the Americans. It was he who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack of December 1941, and while the Japanese public still viewed him as a national hero, the Americans were keen to eliminate the man responsible for thousands of American deaths. In April 1943, the Americans decoded an intercepted radio message that revealed Admiral Yamamoto would make a flight in the Solomons on an inspection trip to his troops. The bomber carrying the VIP was to land on an island near Bougainville in the North Solomons. Seizing the opportunity, on April the 18th, 4 American fighter aircraft took off from Guadalcanal, following orders from President Roosevelt, and homed in on Yamamoto's flight path. The bomber carrying the Admiral was attacked and sent plummeting down into the jungle of Bougainville. Yamamoto's body was later recovered by a Japanese search party, but Tokyo did not announce his death until weeks later, for fear it would affect morale. Despite this moral and strategic victory, however, the Americans were likewise unable to announce the truth right away. Had they played their trump card here, they'd have revealed the ace up their sleeve, the fact that they had cracked the Japanese radio code. Keeping this secret alive let the Allies continue to lay bare the all-important plans of Japan's military, allowing for far more effective defensive and counterattacks from the Allies. The strike rate against Japanese vessels rose dramatically through 1943, as the Americans targeted both military and merchant shipping, and even fishing fleets. Slowly but surely, the Allies were gaining the upper hand in the stormy waters of the Pacific, and with General Douglas MacArthur at the helm as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area, the Japanese were now facing a formidable enemy at sea, in the air, and on land. Taking control in the skies had continued to be a preoccupation in the South Pacific, where American and Australian forces were gradually making inroads along the southernmost perimeter of Japanese-held territory. One major target was the island of Rabaul, but it was very heavily entrenched with Japanese forces. To counter this, MacArthur employed an island-hopping strategy over the coming months. Instead of steamrolling his troops into the formidable Japanese defences, he utilised America's now dominant aerial and naval forces to move from island to island, defeating the weaker garrisons and isolating the stronger ones. This strategy worked very well, with more and more territory falling to the Allied advance. The Japanese were still firmly holed up in certain island strongholds, but even their strength on Rabaul wouldn't help against the superior tactics of the Americans. On the 1st of November, US soldiers from the 3rd Marine Division landed in Empress Augusta Bay on the Solomon Island of Bougainville. Backed up by an impressive US naval task force of 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, and commanded by the brilliant Rear Admiral Aaron S. Tip Merrill, the Americans quickly consolidated their position. The Japanese were equally quick to respond, launching air attacks from Rabaul as well as dispatching their own powerful task force of cruisers and destroyers. Merrill was the first American Rear Admiral to use radar, and in this battle it gave him a major advantage. Without radar, the Japanese commander failed to assess the outcome of the battle accurately when Merrill retreated under cover of smoke. Returning to Rabaul, the Japanese believed they'd been victorious and prepared to re-attack the Allied landing forces at Bougainville without realising Merrill's task force was still very much intact. 2 US aircraft carriers raided Rabaul on the 5th of November, and having underestimated their enemy, the Japanese fleet sustained heavy losses, which meant that any danger to the now well-established US Marines from Japan's Imperial Navy had for the time being at least passed. While America seemingly struggled alone against the entrenched Japanese, across the waters, the British had made headway in allying with Stalin, finally forcing a 2-pronged attack against Nazi Germany. This compounded the main problem which Hitler was faced with at this time, his steadily declining troop numbers. Having to occupy Italy, as well as coping with another bitterly cold winter on the Russian front, was spreading the depleted German military far too thin. With German intelligence recognising that an invasion by Allied forces in Western Europe was inevitably going to happen sometime in 1944, Hitler, just 2 days before the US raid on Rabaul, issued an order known as Directive 51. This gave a stark warning that anticipated a massive Allied offensive, giving his propaganda minister Goebbels one of his toughest tasks to date. With the threat of invasion hanging over them, he needed to convince the German people that the Führer and their nation were still invincible. Goebbels' personal diaries offer a fascinating insight, and on the day before Hitler issued Directive 51, Goebbels made an entry regarding the fact that more than 9,000 German soldiers had been killed on the Eastern Front in just 9 days. He said, "We cannot sustain such a drain for long. We are in danger of slowly bleeding to death in the East." Whatever the public face of Nazi propaganda, Goebbels, like many of his fellow high-ranking officials, was fully aware of the all-too-real danger of Germany being defeated. Without doubt, the Nazi propaganda machine was being stretched to the full by the events in Western Europe and Russia. However, the Japanese government was even more determined that the people of Japan should believe that their brave imperial warriors were victorious in every campaign of the Pacific Offensive. There There were of course plenty of occasions when they did score direct hits against the Allies, particularly out at sea. On the 19th of November, the Japanese Navy sunk the USS Sculpin, a Sargo-class submarine. Appropriately named after a remarkably stealthy fish that can survive out of water as well as in it, and capable of inflicting a painful sting, the sinking of the Sculpin was a major blow to the American Navy. Yet the Japanese missed a golden opportunity to gain intelligence regarding the devastating attack the Allies were planning for the very next day on the 3 atolls in the Gilbert Islands, Makin, Tarawa and Abomana. Aboard the Sculpin was Captain John P. Cromwell, who'd been fully briefed on the offensive to take the Gilbert Islands, codenamed Operation Galvanic. This made him a prime target for the Japanese, who would have undoubtedly, had he been captured, been able to extract vital information about the operation via torture methods. Aware of this, when the submarine was first hit and the commander killed, Cromwell took the initiative to go down with the ship. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for devotion to his country and fellow servicemen. Silver linings like this were found in many small conflicts during the war up to this point. True victories were much harder to come by. However, things were about to change dramatically. Strategically, the Gilbert Islands were of vital importance as the Allies increased their operations from the mid-Pacific to the Philippines and prepared to advance on Japan. Taking the Mariana Islands from the Japanese would be crucial if the US Navy stood any chance of succeeding in this objective, but naturally, Imperial Japan was all too aware of this. Because the Marianas, including the all-important island of Guam, had become a major target, Japanese reinforcements had been drafted in, with fortifications consolidated to make the entire area as secure as possible. The Americans knew that they would have to advance island group by island group, because before they could even reach the Marianas, they would need to wrestle the nearby Marshall Islands from Japanese control. But before they could do that, the enemy garrison on the Tarawa Atoll needed to be neutralized. By now, the Americans had enough experience of the Japanese to come prepared, and as Operation Galvanic began on the 20th of November, over 6,000 US troops landed on Makin. On paper, the occupying army, made up of 300 Japanese soldiers and 500 Korean labourers, should have been easily defeated. But the battle was bitterly contested, and American casualties were high. It was a costly operation in other respects too, as the US escort carrier Liscum Bay was torpedoed, killing 644 of the 900 crew. Then an accident aboard the US battleship Mississippi during the pre-landing bombardment of Makin, when the turret exploded, resulted in a further 43 American deaths. The people of Makin were nevertheless delighted to greet their US liberators, offering coconuts as a token of their gratitude. With Makin secure, American troops began their assault on Tarawa Atoll. Again, about 6,000 of them, but there were 5,000 Japanese soldiers laying in wait for them. With the odds much more even this time, the costs on both sides were all the more bloody. Over some 76 hours, more than 1,000 Americans were killed. However, these casualties were vastly outnumbered by their Japanese enemies. Of the several thousand that initially defended the island, only one officer and 16 of his men survived, along with 129 conscripted Korean labourers who'd helped make up the numbers. For the American people, who had so far been protected by heavy censorship, the now unrestricted news reports were hugely shocking. Many condemned Washington for allowing the offensive to go ahead after seeing photographs of America's brave young men floating dead in the water. The realization that the Japanese were going to put up a long and terrible fight really did hit home. With their experiences on Macon and Tarawa, the Americans changed their tactics when they reached Abamana. Despite the much smaller Japanese garrison, one Marine was killed within minutes during an attempted landing, so it was decided to settle for using Navy gunfire only to clear the army of occupation. It was certainly effective, but not in terms of direct hits. Because of the 25 Japanese defenders, only 14 had been killed by gunfire. The rest had committed suicide. While certainly small, victories like this were taking place for the Allies across the world. There were many major offensives like the bombing of Berlin and the continuing Italian campaign, but the little events were beginning to play a huge part too. In France, the resistance was undermining the German occupation at every turn, and with help from British agents, the preparations for the long-awaited invasion of the coast of northern France were piece by piece being slotted into place. Pulling all of the various elements of the Allied push for victory together was far from being an easy task. Meetings between the Allied leaders were incredibly difficult to orchestrate. Prime example of this was the Cairo Conference, held between the 22nd and the 26th of November. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, and America's President Roosevelt met with China's Chiang Kai-shek to discuss the Allied position against the Japanese. Russia's Joseph Stalin refused to attend, as he believed, with the Chinese present, it would be viewed by the Japanese as provocation on the part of the Soviets. On the 27th of November, the Cairo Declaration was nevertheless signed by the three leaders present, stating that the Allies would continue to employ military force until Japan's unconditional surrender. It was also decided that when that happened, all the islands of the Pacific seized by the Japanese since the First World War would be taken back. All territories Japan had seized from China would also be restored, and last, but by no means least, Korea would become independent. With the Cairo Conference complete, Churchill and Roosevelt looked towards further discussions on the Allies' plans to invade France. While Stalin's absence from Cairo had been manageable, it was time for the Big Three, as they were so often dubbed, to meet as the Tehran Conference began. Stalin had not travelled outside Russia since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, but the three unlikely allies arrived in Tehran amid the tightest security to agree the plan for an Anglo-American cross-channel invasion planned for spring or summer 1944. The next 6 months of warfare are some of the most well documented in history, as the Allies planned and executed the massive invasion of occupied France, beginning with Operation Overlord on what would be known as D-Day. However, while there were certainly huge developments with the war in Europe, this wasn't the only theatre to see some impressive victories for the Allies. In the Pacific, MacArthur was making good on his promise to return to the Philippines that he'd made back in 1942. Despite a valiant defence of the area, MacArthur had famously been ordered to evacuate with his family and staff by Roosevelt himself. He had done so begrudgingly, leaving the troops on the ground with a phrase that helped rally them in the coming months: "I will return." He wasn't a man to go back on his word. This was the first of many Japanese strongholds to fall in the coming months as the US increased pressure on their enemies. They'd progressed far enough now to make direct assaults on Tokyo itself, dropping incendiary bombs onto the mainly wood-constructed buildings. This caused massive devastation, levelling many blocks of housing and war manufacturing plants. During one raid, over 325 B-29s were used, dropping magnesium, phosphorus and napalm into the packed housing districts. Ultimately, over 16 square miles of city were consumed by the flames, killing over 100,000 inhabitants who were simply turned to ash overnight. However, it isn't these devastating raids that are stuck in the minds of the American people, but the Battle of Iwo Jima, which saw the Japanese forces crushed in a decisive fight that would hail the beginning of the end of the war in the Pacific. 800 miles south of Japan, Iwo Jima was a mostly uninhabited island. At only 4 miles long and 2 wide, it seemed an odd place for such a battle. However, the Americans wanted it badly, in order to convert it into an airstrip for General Curtis LeMay's B-29 Superfortresses and P-51 Mustang fighter escorts. The attack on Iwo Jima started with 10 weeks of heavy bombing and 3 days naval bombardment to break down Japanese defences. Then, at 2 a.m. on February the 19th, 1945, Operation Detachment, the invasion of Iwo Jima, began. As a storm of high explosives and steel lashed the island, 70,000 US Marines braced themselves for an assault landing, and just before 9 a.m, the first waves of US Marines hit the beach. Much to their surprise, they found no sign of the enemy, and for a brief moment they thought that the weeks of bombing and shelling had destroyed the Japanese defences. However, the reality of the situation was quite the opposite, and the massive American bombardment had left Iwo Jima's 23,000-strong garrison virtually unharmed, hidden away in an extensive complex of tunnels, bunkers, weapons pits and gun emplacements. Suddenly the air was filled with the thunder of the heaviest mortar and artillery fire that many of the American troops had ever seen, much of it from gun emplacements on Mount Suribachi. The scene was described by one reporter as a nightmare from hell. Nevertheless, despite the growing number of casualties, the American forces slowly edged closer towards the base of Mount Suribachi. This resulted in the containment of the Japanese troops defending the mountain, and on the 5th day of the invasion, February the 23rd, 1945, a Marine patrol managed to reach the summit and unfurl the Stars and Stripes. A short time later, 5 US Marines and a US Navy medic raised a second and much larger American flag over Mount Suribachi, and the dramatic photograph taken of the event was soon circulating around the world. It came to symbolize the raw courage of the US Marine Corps, but the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over. 3 of the men in Joe Rosenthal's stirring photograph were killed shortly afterwards, as the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, reinforced by the 3rd US Marine Division, proceeded to clear the rest of the island. The Marines suffered extremely heavy casualties as they fought for Iwo Jima, quite literally, yard by yard. Over the course of a month's bitter fighting, the Japanese on Iwo Jima were gradually dragged from their underground hideouts, but it cost the lives of many Americans. On the 16th of March, Iwo Jima was declared officially secure, but another 5 days passed before the Japanese command post on the northwest side of the island was located and destroyed. Finally, on March the 26th, 1945, after 35 days of the bitterest fighting, the battle was over. However, even with the war slowly drawing to a close, there was still some of the bitterest fighting yet to come. Mainland Japan had yet to be conquered or subdued, and it was down to the brave men and women of the US Armed Forces to carry out this duty.